The lore of the Elder Scrolls has changed. Actually, it's changed many times over the history of the series, but I'm talking about the big changes that happened between Daggerfall and Morrowind. You see, the first two Elder Scrolls games were sort of generic. Sure, they had some cool elements, but for the most part, they seemed like standard, run of the mill fantasy. But then Bethesda writers came up with lore so bizarre, so unique, so exciting that no game before or after Morrowind even came close to it. And even though Bethesda later decided to tone down the weirdness for the next entries in the series, this cool lore is still at the core of the franchise today. And it just so happens that all of it was outlined in a single booklet that I will walk you through today. So pour yourself a mug of Sujama and let's get ready for some classic Elder Scrolls lore. This is A Pocket Guide to the Empire Volume 1. This video, or maybe I should say this podcast, is basically a single-player book club. I will go through this entire book, talk about its coolest parts, and introduce it to you as if you've never read it, and I will try to be pretty thorough in giving you a complete picture of Tamriel as far as the guide gives us one. The footage will be mostly just screenshots from the guide, so feel free to use this as second screen content or maybe something to fall asleep to, however you wish. Are you on board? Alright, let's get to it. So before we talk about the book itself, we gotta talk about Elder Scrolls lore. For my purposes here, I've basically divided the lore of the Elder Scrolls into three basic stages over the lifetime of the series. You could definitely make the case for dividing it into even more stages, but anyway. So the first stage is before the Pocket Guide. This was the era of Arena and Daggerfall, the first two Elder Scrolls games. I haven't played those, but I've read about them quite a lot, and from what I understand, the lore back then was fairly generic. It was mostly based on D&D and traditional fantasy, and even though it had some cool elements, like for example Daggerfall I believe introduced the Daedra into the Elder Scrolls, it was still not that recognizable when compared to other fantasy universes out there. But then the Pocket Guide to the Empire came out with Redguard, which was this spin-off game released a few years before Morrowind. And this is what I essentially consider the golden age of Elder Scrolls lore. Redguard and Morrowind. Those two games portrayed the lore as much more alien, more esoteric, metaphysical, original, just what I like to affectionately call the cool lore. Then, after Morrowind, there was Oblivion and Skyrim, at least as far as single-player Elder Scrolls games go, and these made some pretty significant changes to the lore, I would say. Changes that many fans of Morrowind, like myself, are not really okay with. That being said, the Pocket Guide is still the foundation of the lore even for those games. Bethesda sometimes decided to deviate from the lore in pretty significant ways, but I think as we go through the guide you will recognize elements which were retained, and there are quite a lot of them. So because of these changes, the Elder Scrolls community is a bit divided in that some fans prefer some versions of the lore over another. For example, I most like the version presented by Morrowind and continuously expanded by the modding projects Project Tamriel and Tamriel Rebuilt. That being said, this video is pretty unbiased. It's basically common to all fans of all the games from Morrowind through Skyrim and beyond. So I will essentially go through the Pocket Guide and take it at face value. I will not really bring in any outside sources, maybe just a bit to sort of complete the picture, but I will try to keep it quite strictly focused on the Pocket Guide. And I will also not be taking into account any latter games or Project Tamriel Rebuilt. So even if you're a fan of Oblivion or Skyrim, I think this video will still have a lot of value to you. In the best Elder Scrolls fashion, the Pocket Guide is a highly biased source. I gotta say, this is one of my favorite things about Tamriel, is that we never get the objective version of events. Every lore book was written by someone who has a motivation, who is trying to accomplish something with this book, to portray a historical narrative in some way. So there is not really an objective truth that you can draw from. And the Pocket Guide to the Empire is no different. This booklet was promulgated under the authority of the Imperial Geographical Society, which is obviously an institution affiliated with the Empire. The booklet describes the history, people, and geography of Tamriel's regions. So it basically goes through the regions one by one, Skyrim, Cyrodiil, High Rock, Hammerfell. It goes through all the different regions of Tamriel and describes them for the purpose of educating imperial citizens, but also for some other purposes, as we will see. Because it's written from an imperial-centric perspective, it is highly biased against other races and against certain regions. And this bias is not just reflected with how the information is portrayed, but also in the amount of information that is portrayed. Skyrim and Cyrodiil get by far the most space in this pocket guide, whereas provinces like Elsweyr are completely shrouded in mystery to the imperial author, and we learn comparatively very little about them. There is also a significant racial bias. So the elves are at this time essentially portrayed as the enemies of the humans. The beast folk are usually portrayed as these primitive tribes that need to be civilized. And of course, the Empire and the humans as a whole are basically the beacon of civilization. They are the ones enlightening the world by conquering it and taking it over, but we will come to that. This highly biased perspective basically permeates the entire guide, so we will have to keep it in mind as we read all the different information. I will sometimes remind you of it, and sometimes not, but just remember that everything here should be questioned. Now, a little bit of historical context for the release of this guide. So the guide came out in the year 864 of the Second Era, which is approximately 500 years before Morrowind. During this time, Tiber Septim, also known as Talos and Isbir and by many other names, has founded the Third Empire and is conquering Tamriel. His purpose is essentially to subjugate the entire continent. And the specific guide was released as a celebration of Battle of Hunding Bay, also known as the Battle of Stros M'Kai, which joined Hammerfell to the Empire, Hammerfell being the last human kingdom which resisted. So the Empire now essentially represents all of humanity. The imperial author who wrote the guide essentially expresses this adoration of Tiber Septim, and there are frequent references to his wisdom and might and courage, and I will spare you most of those things, although I will mention them sometimes when relevant. But interestingly enough, the author of the Pocket Guide is actually not our only source. We have another, because this specific copy of the guide was owned by an Altmer spy. This person, who signs his initials only as YR, has traveled around Tamriel, and he has actually been to the regions described in the guide. And what he does is he annotates this guide for the purpose of sending it to his uncle, who is on the Thalmor, the Altmer government. So he will sometimes write annotations. He will underline certain passages that he finds important, or maybe, well, mostly outrageous, actually, passages that he disagrees with. He will scribble, he will draw various figures from around Tamriel. So we're not just getting one biased source, we're getting two highly biased sources, biased against each other, that is. From the letter that YR writes to his uncle on the cover of the guide, we come to understand that he views the Empire as the ultimate threat, but he also admits that Tiber Septim may be dragonborn. It's not just some imperial propaganda. And yeah, he just describes how he's annotated the guide to correct what he considers to be falsehoods and add his own observations to kind of complete our view of the provinces. Alright, let's get into the actual first chapter of the guide, which will give us some general info about Tamriel. And I will quote directly here. Quote, Tamriel itself is generally divided into 8 major regions: Skyrim, Cyrodiil, High Rock, the Aldmeri Dominion of the Somerset Isles and Valenwood, Hammerfell, Morrowind, and the Elsweyr Confederacy. Some of these, such as Morrowind or Skyrim, have historically been unified into kingdoms. Others, such as High Rock or Elsweyr, are looser groupings of many kingdoms, chiefdoms, village confederations, and so forth, united under a dominant race or culture. End quote. Now, if you listen to this list of countries carefully, you might have noticed that Argonia, the home of the Argonians, is completely missing from this list. It's not considered important enough to even be mentioned here, but it will still get its own small section in the guide as part of a chapter called the Wild Regions, which will actually be the concluding chapter of the guide. We also get a description of the other continents of the world besides Tamriel. To the north is Atmora, to the west, Yokuda, To the east, Akavir, and to the south, all is mystery and the whispers of a lost elven homeland. A lost elven homeland that the YR calls Old Elnofey in his annotation. Now, as for the regions of Tamriel, when they were controlled by the Second Empire, they were organized into provinces, all with the exception of Morrowind, because Morrowind was the only province to never be conquered by the Second Empire. We will come to hear more about the Second Empire as part of some of these chapters. For now, you just need to know that Tiber Septim's empire is the third of its kind, and that even though the Second Empire managed to conquer most of these regions, when it fell, they all became independent once again, and chaos ensued. So Tiber Septim's ambition is essentially to reunite them all under his rule. Quote, "The Aldmeri Dominion, the Elsweyr Confederacy, and Morrowind have yet to join the Empire, but are described in this book for the edification of the scholar, the fascination of the common citizen, and the preparation of the soldier." End quote. Did you catch that? This is meant for soldiers. This is meant as justification for them to go and conquer their regions. This is meant to guide them in their conquest. So yeah, we're reading a whole bunch of imperial propaganda here, and I couldn't be more excited. Let's get to the first province. The first region of Tamriel discussed in the guide is Skyrim, and there's a very simple reason for that. Skyrim was the first region settled by humans. So obviously the society views it as the origin story of humanity on Tamriel, and humanity is, in their view, almost like the chosen people who are destined to conquer Tamriel. So it feels appropriate to start here. The history of Skyrim begins with Ysgramor. This is of course a legendary name. You would have definitely heard this name if you played Skyrim. And Ysgramor was a settler from Atmora. Atmora is the frozen continent to the north of Tamriel, as we heard in the intro. But in the times of Ysgramor, it actually seems to have been not that frozen, and there seems to have been a substantial population there. Substantial enough for a civil war to break out. So Ysgramor, with his two sons and some other settlers, decided to escape the civil war by moving to Tamriel. They landed at Hassaric Head, which is the northernmost point of Skyrim, I believe, and there they met the elves. So this is the origin story of humanity on Tamriel. So obviously the elves were the majority race on the continent, and for that reason the humans called the continent Mereth. At first, the guide tells us that the relations between the man and Mer were peaceful. The humans felt comfortable enough here, and they decided to build their own colony, the city of Sarthal, which was only recently located, actually, according to the guide, close to Winterhold in Skyrim. But despite the peaceful relations, elves sort of became envious of the success of the humans. The guide even tells us that, quote, "the elves saw that the vital young race would soon surpass their stagnant culture," end quote. And for this reason, what they decided to do was murder everybody. During what is known today as the Night of Tears, they fell upon the city and killed everyone. The only people to escape were Ysgramor and his two sons, who escaped back to Atmora. Now, this is a very one-sided version of the story, obviously. It's kind of hard to believe that after these peaceful relations, the elves suddenly decided to just eradicate everyone. And of course, YR confirms our suspicion here, because he writes, "Ysgramor's provocations and blasphemies have of course been long forgotten," suggesting that the human authors of the guide are trying to shift the blame from humanity more to the elves, which is of course what they would do. Now, Ysgramor didn't just stay in Atmora. He actually decided to come back to Tamriel with 500 hardened warriors, and these warriors are known today as the 500 Companions, another legendary name in the history of Skyrim, because they actually managed to drive the elves out of Skyrim. At least that's what the legend says. In any case, they are so popular even today that their names are still recited every 13th of Sun's Dawn at the Feast of the Dead in Windhelm. So every year at this feast, they recite the names of the 500 companions one by one. And actually, even today, there are no elves in Skyrim. Now, there is the concept of the snow elf, or the Falmer. But at the time of writing this pocket guide, these are basically an urban legend, a sort of mythical figure in folk tales, but there is no tangible evidence of them actually existing. And YR even confirms this. He says, "Uncle, I saw signs that might be Falmer boundary runes, but nothing sure. If any survive, they are wary and withdrawn." So unlike in the game of Skyrim, where you basically meet the elves every time you step into a Dwemer ruin, here they are really mythological figures. And what the Nords do is they essentially attribute all sorts of random misfortunes to them. So if you're like a farmer and you lose your sheep goes missing, you're like, oh, it must have been stolen by the Falmer, you know? Or if, I don't know, if your crops aren't growing, you're like, oh, well, it must be the fault of the snow elves, or something like that. So they've become this kind of folk tale, basically. Now, you might be thinking, it's kind of hard to believe that Ysgramor, with his 500 companions, managed to conquer all of Skyrim, managed to sort of drive out the elves out of this entire enormous region. And you would be absolutely right. Even the authors of the guide admit that this is probably a case of mythological attribution, you know? In history, what often happens is that the great deeds of a dynasty get ascribed to the founder of the dynasty as if they were the one who did it all on their own, you know? So it wasn't just Ysgramor who drove out the elves, it was actually his line of descendants, and only the 13th of his line, King Harald, was actually the one to finish this conquest of Tamriel. He also decided to give up his holdings in Atmora, because up until now the Nords of Skyrim would still cling to their old holdings back in Atmora, presumably as a sort of backup in case they needed to escape the region again. That's my speculation here. But at this point, Harald basically decided, Tamriel is our home, it belongs to humanity, we will conquer it, and that's it for us. So this is basically the point of separation of the Nords of Atmora from the Nords of Tamriel. And actually, it's the origin story of all humans on Tamriel, because even the Cyrodiils, even the Imperials, are descended from Ysgramor and the Companions. The only human race on Tamriel which came from Elsweyr, were the Red Guards, and we will of course talk about that in the Hammerfell section of the guide. So because Skyrim is basically the birthplace of humanity on Tamriel, it is also called the Old Kingdom, or the Fatherland. And this detail is included by the guide, of course, to promote this sort of imperial cohesion, because remember, the point of this guide is to sort of... it's imperial propaganda, right? It's meant to convince you that humanity is destined to conquer Tamriel. But YR tells us that this propaganda sometimes falls on deaf ears. He says, quote, "Most of the Nords I met seemed amused by this fatherland nonsense. The war with the Aldmeri Dominion was the furthest thing in their minds," end quote. Again, we see the value of having another source contradict the highly biased source that is giving us most of the information. Another important king of Skyrim was Rage the Gifted. He actually began a process of expansion, which apparently lasted only 50 years, and during this process, Skyrim grew into the First Empire, the so-called First Empire of the Nords. Because at this point, the Nords came to dominate not only Skyrim, but also most of High Rock, Nibelheim Valley, and the entire province of Morrowind. And the conquest of Morrowind especially seemed to have been just an epic clash of human warlords against the Dunmer warriors, and apparently minstrels in Skyrim still sing of these victories today. What made the Nords so powerful that they were able to conquer all of Tamriel? Well, they had access to this spiritual type of magic called the Way of the Voice. This is a peculiar form of magic associated with wind, with the goddess Kinnares, who the Nords of course venerate, and the guide explains it like this. Quote, "Masters of the voice are known as tongues, and their power is legendary. They can call to specific people over hundreds of miles, and can move by casting a shout, appearing where it lands. The most powerful tongues cannot speak without causing destruction. They must go gagged, and communicate through a sign language and through scribing runes." So all those great Nordic warlords who conquered Morrowind were actually tongues, and the way they would conquer a city is they would simply line up before the gate and they would shout at it collectively until the gate flew open and they were able to descend upon the city and just slaughter everyone. This is what made Skyrim so powerful until Jurgen Windcaller. Jurgen Windcaller was a legendary tongue the most powerful of all, but he came to embrace the philosophy of pacifism. So he actually decided that the way of the voice should no longer be used in warfare. And of course the other tongues and the other Nords did not really like this. We have accounts of this legendary confrontation between him on one side and 17 other tongues on the other. The tongues would shout at him, and he would just stand there and take it. He would swallow their shouts, not attacking them in any way. And this went on for 3 days until all 17 tongues fell exhausted to the ground, and then they became his disciples. They subscribed to his philosophy, and ever since then, the way of the voice has been the dominant philosophy among the tongues. And it's the reason why today the voice is kind of a lost art almost in many ways. But that is beginning to change, because the guide tells us that Tiber Septim, since he was so grateful to the Greybeards for prophesying him as the hero and conqueror of Tamriel, we will talk more about that in the Cyrodiil section of the guide. So Tiber Septim, in his gratitude, has endowed the new Imperial College of the Voice in Markarth. This institution in Markarth is basically supposed to teach the Nords to use the voice again, to spread the art again, and the voice will presumably again be used for war, unsurprisingly, in the services of Tiber Septim. YR has been to this college and he is not impressed. He says, "Septim's new college is staffed by hacks and charlatans. The so-called Grand Master is said to have formerly earned his living as a street performer in Windhelm. The students are scions of the most obsequious Nord families, hoping to curry favor with Tiber Septim's new order." So there is obviously a lot of protectionism going on there. But still, the College of the Voice is real once again. But now we come to the end of the First Empire. So the king of the First Empire, the king of Skyrim, was usually elected by a moot. This was basically a council of powerful figures who decided which member of the royal family would succeed the king. And at the end of the reign of King Harold, who actually ruled for an extraordinary amount of time, and he lived until he was 108 years old, there were a lot of disputes about who should succeed him, because all his heirs apparent died. He outlived them all. But over generations, the moot increasingly became more and more powerful, more and more partisan, The members were sort of fighting for their own interests instead of the interests of the kingdom. And when King Borgus was killed by the Wild Hunt, which is something that we will talk about in the Valenwood chapter, the moot actually failed to elect the best candidate, and this sparked the Skyrim War of Succession. During this civil war, Skyrim basically lost all their territories in High Rock, Cyrodiil, and Morrowind, and established its current borders as they are today. And of course, after the disaster that was this war, the king decided to limit the power of the moot. So in the future, the moot would only be called when the king had no direct heirs, and this seems to have worked out much better because this is how succession has been done in Skyrim ever since. So this was a short chapter about the history of the region. Now let's talk about what the province actually looks like. Skyrim is a very vertical region. There are a lot of mountains everywhere, and the population that is there mostly lives in narrow valleys. Skyrim actually contains 4 out of the 5 highest mountains in Tamriel. As for agriculture, farming can mostly be done in the occasional river valleys. Now, original Nord settlements were built in sort of elevated places where they would be easier to defend, but new towns today are constructed in valleys. There's no longer as big of a need for defensive positions as there used to be. That being said, in the more isolated holds of Skyrim, people still inhabit even the original old Nordic settlements. Construction-wise, the Nords are very skilled at building out of wood and timber. The guide tells us that even structures that are 3,000 years old survive today from the days of the First Empire and before. For example, there is Old Fort, which is located at the southern frontier of the First Empire, and it's basically constructed out of these huge wooden blocks. It doesn't look like it was constructed by humans at all. Politically, the region is divided into 9 holds. The authors go out of their way to mention the Reach, because the Reach is very unlike the other holds of Skyrim. It actually looks quite similar to High Rock, because it's a very cosmopolitan region. In the Reach, the Nords are actually only about half of the population Then there are the northwestern holds of Winterhold, Eastmarch, Rift, and the Pale, which are also called the Old Holds. They are sort of isolated from the rest of the province, not just geographically because of the mountains, but also culturally, of course. And the people there often follow their old traditions. So, for example, there's this description of a ritual of rite of passage in which young men must venture into the mountains to hunt ice wraiths. Also in this region, the people there respect their hereditary leaders. This is in stark contrast to some of the other holds where leaders are often elected. The authors of the guide view this as fortunate. They are actually glad that someone in Skyrim is preserving these old traditions, and the authors say that the rebirth of the province will be led by these true Nords. Now, why R's take on this is wildly different. He says that when he visited these villages, it was suspicious to see so few young men there. And he explains that Tiber Septim essentially seduced them into their army. So the villages have basically lost their strongest warriors, their strongest workers. There is no hope that they will ever see them again because they are waging Tiber Septim's wars. And of course, the guide doesn't mention this at all. Now let's talk about some important places in the province. The first of them is the city of Hafengar, also called Solitude. This is a highly important port because it ships all the way to Wayrest, West Anvil, even Senchal, and it also contains the Bard's College. The Bard's College has a sort of a heretical reputation because the students there seem to be very much focused on carousing, on revelry, and the prime example of this is the festival of the burning of King Olaf. Interestingly enough, nobody even knows who King Olaf was. The guide says that he might have possibly been a forgotten contender in the War of Succession. Of course, the main point of this festival is having a lot of fun. But overall, the Bard's College is still very prestigious, so its graduates can be found across all of Tamriel. They are either employed by noblemen in their households, or they are wandering bards. So yeah, definitely an important place in Skyrim. Another great city is Windhelm, which was actually the capital of the First Empire, and as such, you can find the palace of Isgramor's dynasty there. In the history of the city, it was sacked twice, so not many buildings remain from that day, but the palace is definitely the most important of them. It is also the only big city in Eastmarch, which otherwise is sort of a more rural hold. And it serves as the base for Imperials, who are guarding the way into Morrowind, the Dunmeth Pass. And the last place emphasized by the guide is the Throat of the World, which is of course the highest mountain in Skyrim. Now, it has a lot of religious significance for the Nords as well, because they believe that men were formed here. You might think that it's kind of weird, because we know that the Nords came over from Atmora, but they actually believe that men were originally formed here at the Throat of the World, then moved to Atmora, and Isgramor's expedition was essentially a return home. The guide also talks about the famous 7,000 steps that you have to ascend to get to High Hrothgar, where the Greybeards live. The Greybeards, the practitioners of the Way of the Voice, the sort of ancient order of monks meditating in silence. The guide talks about them with a lot of respect, and YR, interestingly enough, actually echoes this. He says, quote, "At last a few men worthy of respect. I met with an ancient greybeard who could actually converse with me almost as an equal, my only such experience among the humans so far." End quote. This is high praise coming from an Aldmer, obviously. So, as we've heard, Skyrim has a rich history. It's full of legendary figures, full of legendary myths. It's also kind of a romantic region in that it's full of mountains. It's definitely difficult to traverse. And the Imperial Geographical Society tries to portray this as the past and future of mankind, and really just the most important region of Tamriel together with Cyrodiil. And I think we can identify a few specific reasons why that's the case. First of all, it's the origin of men on Tamriel. It's also the center of the First Empire, which of course was the precursor of the current Third Empire of Tiber Septim. It is also the birthplace of Tiber Septim himself, which is something that we will hear more about in the Cyrodiil section. Its authors also value the traditions found and followed, especially in the Old Holds today. That was it for Skyrim. Now let's move on to Cyrodiil. The chapter on Cyrodiil is definitely the most detailed in the guide, and this is because it not only contains information about the region, but also about Tiber Septim, who of course is the most important figure in the empire right now. But even then, Cyrodiil is actually the largest region of Tamriel, and the guide describes it as a river-based society surrounded by jungle. This is what most of Cyrodiil is supposed to look like. In the central part is, of course, the grassy Nibene Valley and the rivers surrounded by a rainforest. If we go south, the land becomes more subtropical, and this apparently continues until Topol Bay and the borders with Argonia. To the west, the countryside rises a bit. To the north, it rises much more rapidly, of course, because that's the site of the mountains that Cyrodiil shares with Skyrim. In the province, we can also find many deciduous forests and mangroves. Now, as we established in the Skyrim chapter, the origin of the Imperials is actually the origin of the Nords, so it makes sense to start talking about the Cyrodiils at the point in which they separate from the Nords of Skyrim. So some of the original Nords came to the Nibene Valley, or thereabouts, and this was a region where they could be largely self-reliant, which was of course the cause of the cultural and economic separation from Skyrim which came to define them. Life here wasn't exactly idyllic because they had to fight constant elven attacks, and apparently this is actually the origin of the battle mage. They felt the need to defend themselves, so they sort of invented this powerful class of warrior to fight the elves. YR doesn't exactly agree with this assessment. He doesn't think that the Imperials invented the battle mage, and he writes, "Our old students forget themselves." So that makes me think that the battle mage might not be an entirely Imperial invention, as the guide is trying to portray, or maybe he's just referring to the fact that magic as a whole is more elven in nature. Anyway, the Nibene Valley is obviously fertile. It's a great place to live, especially if you compare it to the mountains of Skyrim. So it becomes a sort of cultural and military center. And of course, the mages, which defended the Cyrodiil so well that they could establish civilization here, essentially came to rule this civilization. They slowly transformed themselves into the Alessian priesthood. Now, we gotta talk about the Alessian order, because this was an incredibly influential religion, very, very popular historically. It was started in Colovia, which is the western part of Cyrodiil, by Prophet Maruk, and it came to be led by Saint Alessia. Alessia was originally a slave. The elves would, of course, enslave the humans that they managed to capture, so she, as a slave, led an uprising against the elves, and this uprising was indeed very successful. She basically came to found the Alessian Empire. As for the order, what defines it compared to the rest of the religions is that it is monotheistic. It is focused on the abstract concept of a single god. Now, of course, to appease the masses who would worship various Aedra, Daedra divines in various forms, they had to incorporate some polytheistic elements to appease them. This worked very well for them. They came to have an incredible authority, and they basically ruled most of the civilized world, let's say, for nearly a third of the First Era. But eventually, there came a point at which the different factions within the Empire started to fight amongst themselves, and West Cyrodiil, or Colovia, broke off from the rest of the Empire. But before we get to that, let's talk a bit about some Alessian doctrines, because they are quite interesting. So, for example, there were the restrictions on types of meat which you could eat. And together with the fact that also some cults worshipping various animals started to arise in the empire, and this meant that the Cyrodiils didn't really much care for agriculture or husbandry. They had to make their living somehow, and so they became merchants. The capital city, which is known today as Cyrodiil City, or the Imperial City if you prefer, would trade with the ports of Skyrim and Palatine, which was the southern kingdom of Elsweyr, and this made Nibene Valley very wealthy. Some important trade goods included rice, textiles, hide armor, moon sugar, or ancestor silk. Overall, the unification of Cyrodiil was slow, and it was often interrupted because of the constant elven attacks and also just because of the size of the province. But what I just gave you is really the history of the eastern part of the province, and we also got to talk about the west. Even though Cyrodiils had established themselves well in Nibene Valley, a certain faction of them decided to move away from there. They were determined to conquer the frontier, which meant going west to what is today Colovia, and Rather than trading with others, they sort of decided to plunder. They developed a strong army. They were less focused on magic or industry, and they basically became pirates. This meant that the West could maintain strong independence from the Elysian Order. For example, what we don't see here is the disappearance of the worship of the divines. They still kept their faith in the 8 divines. They kept their autonomy as the Colovian estates. So this split between the East and the West will basically define all of Cyrodiil, because as we will see, the two factions are sort of contradictory. They oppose each other, but they also complete each other, and this has manifested itself many times throughout history. YR here comments on this. He says, quote, "An observation, Colovians feel superior to Nibonese as a people, yet, because the East is the Empire's heart, the Westerners are often neglected in Cyrodiil. Even though the throne is taken continually by kings from the West, the Nibonese quickly assimilate them into their ranks." At this point, the East and West are still basically independent of each other, and the Thracian plague rolls around. Now, this was an incredibly contagious disease, which eradicated over half of Tamriel's population. Supposedly it was caused by the Slode, which is this slug-like race from the island of Thras to the west of Tamriel. They're often considered evil. I can't imagine why. Well, when the Cyrodiils found out about this plague and what havoc it was causing, they decided to punish the Slode. They decided to basically destroy them. An important figure here is Bendu Olo, who was the king of Anvil in those times, and he basically managed to assemble a giant army of not only humans, but also elves and beast folk. Obviously, the plague ravaged Tamriel as a whole, so in a sort of rare moment, the humans actually found common ground with the elves and the beast folk, and they sort of formed just this gigantic army. They completely destroyed the Slode, and they sunk the island of Thras into the sea. When I say completely, I mean completely for the time, because the Slode are of course still alive, and the island of Thras is also back to a certain extent, as we will see in the last sections of the guide. But anyway, this meant that the Cyrodiils were basically hailed as saviors. They managed to save the world through assembling this giant army. And this was actually the first point at which Colovia started to become more prominent than the influential East. This unfortunately led to an infighting which caused the War of Righteousness, the so-called War of Righteousness, which basically destroyed the Elysian Order. It's fascinating because this order ruled this gigantic civilization for hundreds of years, and then it practically ceased to exist over a decade or two. Their end was very brief. So of course the Colovians continued being independent in their Colovian estates, and in Nibene the mages came to be in charge once again. This lasted for 400 years or thereabouts, until Riemann I. So Riemann I was an influential figure from the West, and he managed to avert another great catastrophe. This time it was the Akaviri invasion. The Akaviri are the snake folk from the continent east of Tamriel. They are also called, well, I'm gonna use the Kirkbride pronunciation here. They're also called Zishi, but there are many various pronunciations for this word. And this is what the guide tells us about this war. Quote, "The Cyrodiilic forces engaged the Akaviri in every region of the north, eliciting their surrender at last in the Pale Pass of Skyrim. By war's end, the Cyrodiils found themselves not only united as a nation, but too responsible for the further protection of the northern human kingdoms at large." That's right, this was actually the ultimate point of unification of the West and East into the Second Empire. And Riemann, of course, became Riemann I, the first emperor of the Second Empire. In a sort of genius move, he offered the Akaviri amnesty, and he had a very good reason for this, because after repelling the Akaviri invasion, even though the Second Empire won, it was very much weakened, and it was threatening to crumble, so he offered the Akaviri amnesty in exchange for serving in the army of the Second Empire, to sort of take advantage of their expertise and use it to actually build his empire into something viable that could last for millennia. The author of the guide feels the need to justify this. He says it was, quote, "in order to prevent the elves from attacking the already weakened northern kingdoms," end quote. The Akaviri came to serve in the Second Empire, And later they actually became the Emperor's house guard. We can see that the Imperials clearly came to trust them quite a lot. The chief advisor of the Emperor, whose title was Potentate, was usually an Akaviri. And the Akaviri presence in the Empire just helped establish the administration and helped improve its military, whether through discipline or logistics. It's a widespread consensus that the Akaviri were basically instrumental in helping Riemann's dynasty conquer Tamriel. Even today, we can see a lot of Akaviri imagery in what we see as typically imperial things. So for example, the daikatanas or the dragon scale armor or the other equipment that the blades use. The blades, of course, being the Imperial Secret Service. Also, the symbol of the Empire is the red dragon, but the red dragon was originally an Akaviri war mount. And even though there are no Akaviri in the Empire today, having their facial features or having Akaviri surnames is still seen as something very prestigious. The Cyrodiils are proud of having Akaviri ancestry. The author of the guide then tells us that, quote, some colonies of true Akaviri still exist in both the Empire and its border regions, but they are named so only for their practices and customs than for the purity of their blood, end quote. This was a little window to the present, but now we are coming back to Riemann's dynasty, which actually lasted only for about 200 years. It was a successful dynasty, though. It managed to conquer all of Tamriel except Morrowind, but the emperors had the unfortunate habit of dying to the Morag Tong, to the assassin guild of Morrowind. And with the death of Riemann III during the Fourscore War of Morrowind, the dynasty ceased to exist, and the potentates, the Akaviri, actually came to power in the Empire. They declared the end of the First Era and the beginning of the Second Era, so this was in the year 2920 of the First Era. The Akaviri potentates ruled for another 400 years, but their reign ended with the murder of potentate Severian Chorak. And then came the Interregnum, which was this turbulent time where everybody would sort of try to usurp power. There were a lot of pretenders to the throne, but ultimately none of them came to rule for very long. Nothing really got accomplished. There was a lot of infighting, and this lasted for another 400 years until Kulakain. Kulakain was one of those pretenders who came to power, but he was wise enough to appoint a capable Atmoran general to lead his armies, and the name of this general was Talos. This Talos was born in Atmora, but had studied in Skyrim. He learned to use the Thu'um there. Apparently he could rout armies with his battle cry and shout lesser men off their feet, which is definitely a handy skill to have if you're going to wage war. There are of course a lot of legends about him. For example, the Song of Tiber Septim tells us how he learned the voice, how he fought the witchmen of High Rock, and how the Greybeards announced that they would speak. Of course, the Greybeards being this order of silent monks from Skyrim who never speak because their speech destroys everything in its path. But they decided to speak to announce that he would come to be the ruler of Tamriel. And this was quite the event. Apparently, the surrounding villages had to be evacuated so the people wouldn't get killed by the speech. But Talos, instead of running away, he actually went directly to them to see them. And they told him face to face that he would rule Tamriel and that to do so, he must travel south. So he did. Now this tale of course sounds like a legend, so it could use another perspective, and we're fortunate enough to have the perspective of YR here. He says, "It is certain that the tale of Talos' conquest of the Cyrodiil through the use of his voice is not literally true. That kind of Thu'um is now forbidden. This is all obviously a poetic reference, crafted to satisfy the popular human lust for blood and magic. This young myth is perhaps inspired by Talos' reputation for shrewd diplomacy, attested by even his greatest critics, which permitted him to scheme and bargain his way into the capital city, which he lacked the armies or funds to conquer by dint of force." Whatever the truth about his use of the voice, he was definitely a capable general, because it took him only a year to reclaim about half of the empire. High Rock and Skyrim tried to unite to oppose him, but when they met him on the battlefield, the Nords heard his Thu'um, and they realized that he was, quote, Skyrim's son and the heir to the empires of men, end quote. And they decided to join his army then and there. And this finally helped Kulakain capture the imperial city, and he could proclaim himself emperor. Now the Bretons came back to High Rock, and then in year 854 of the Second Era, they sent a Nightblade to assassinate the Emperor, which they did. They assassinated Emperor Kulakain, they set fire to the royal palace, and they even managed to sneak up on Talos and slit his throat. But, and this is a quote that the guide is quoting from somewhere, but from the smoldering ruin he came, one hand to his neck and with Kulakain's crown in the other. The legions wept at the sight. His northern magic had saved him, but the voice that led them would be more silent from that night on. His word could no longer rout an army with a roar, but he could still command one with a whisper. He took for himself a Cyrodiilic name, Tiber Septim, and a Nordic name, Ismir, Dragon of the North. And with those names he took too the red diamond crown of the Cyrodiils and became their true emperor. YR also comments on this, saying, even those humans who revile Talos as a traitor, oathbreaker, and scoundrel pay homage to his skill in obtaining his ends without resort to warfare. So, yes, Talos' throat was apparently slit, and that's why he can no longer use the voice. Now, you can see why the Altmer would be skeptical that he could ever use the voice in the first place, because there is no way to prove that he did anymore. But even YR here repeatedly admits that he must have been a really shrewd diplomat, he must have been just a capable, practical politician, which is of course evidenced by the fact that he managed to conquer so much. And this is how Talos became the Emperor and founded the Third Empire. Now at this point we've moved from history all the way to the present, and the guide tells us that the Imperial City is finally nearly repaired. The roads and cities destroyed in the turbulent interregnum have been rebuilt, and the East and the West are unified after 400 years. All human regions are united against the Elven menace. YR comments on this briefly, saying, truly a doubtful statement, and we will see a little bit later on in the chapter about Hammerfell why he's saying this. Now, we've talked a lot about the East and the West, but it's also fair to talk about its inhabitants to kind of get the full picture. So let's talk about the Colovians of the West, and I will quote here directly because I think the guy just says it beautifully, better than I ever could. They are uncomplicated, self-sufficient, hearty, and extremely loyal to one another. The Colovian nobility, all officers of the Imperial Legions or its West Navy, do not allow themselves the great expenditure of courtly life as is seen in the capital city. They prefer immaculate uniforms and stark standards hanging from the ceiling of their austere cliff fortresses. To this day, they become a little perplexed when they must visit the grandly decorated assault of color that is the Emperor's palace. So yes, the Colovians are essentially no-nonsense soldiers who really don't feel at home in all this pomp that can be found in the East, in Nibene. And actually most soldiers serving in the Imperial army, in the Ruby ranks, are Colovians. Now let's talk about the Nibenese. Quote, the eastern people of Cyrodiil relish in garish costumes, bizarre tapestries, tattoos, brandings, and elaborate ceremony. End quote. Whereas we heard before that the Colovians still worship the 8 divines, in Nibene there are apparently numerous religious cults. There is ancestor worship, esoteric customs, basically a form of religion which the Colovians often view as bizarre, and we get some more information about some of these cults here. So the cult of Tiber Septim is kind of self-explanatory, and it of course comes as no surprise to us because we know that Tiber Septim will ascend to become the 9th divine, so it's really no surprise that they are already worshipping him while he's alive. Then there is the cult of the Ancestor Moth. So we mentioned previously that the Nibenese used to export ancestor silks, among other goods, and what they do is basically they make these exotic shawls from the silks of these moths. And this is no longer just a cultural tradition, but it also has a religious significance. So, for example, during silk gathering rituals, spirits of forebears are caught in silk, and when someone wearing this silk garment moves, the, quote, resplendent ancestral chorus, end quote, it can be heard. So, because of that, this became a sort of sacred custom.
This is for people wearing the silks, but when it comes to higher order monks, they actually skip this ritual. They don't wear the silks, they simply wear the moths themselves. And the way they do this is they attract them through constantly chanting these sub-vocal mantras, which means that when they are chanting these mantras, they of course cannot speak, cannot say anything else. They have to constantly be humming these mantras to themselves for the moths to stay there. And when someone interrupts this mantra, for example by speaking, the moths, quote, burst from him in glorious fashion, end quote. And when they start chanting again, the moths land again on their body. I just think this is such a cool image that I definitely would like to see in an Elder Scrolls game. That was the cult of the Ancestor Moth, and now let's talk about the cult of Emperor Zero. So this was a cult started by Tiber Septim himself, and it basically worships Khulakain, the previous sort of emperor who appointed Talos general and who retook Imperial City, of course with Talos' help. I think the best place to end the description of the Cyrodiilic society is this beautiful quote. Listen to this. Akaviri dragon motifs are found in all quarters, from the high minaret bridges of the Imperial City to the paper hako skiffs that villagers use to wing their dead down the rivers. Thousands of workers ply the rice fields after the floodings or clear the foliage of the surrounding jungle in the alternate seasons. Above them are the merchant nobility, the temple priests and cult leaders, and the age-old aristocracy of the battle mages. The Emperor watches over them all from the towers of the Imperial City as dragons circle overhead. This version of Cyrodiil just sounds so cool. And it doesn't end there. There is one more section to this chapter of the guide, and it is dedicated to the capital, to the Imperial City itself, which is described as the most spectacular city on the continent. Now, of course, the author is heavily biased, but he can write beautifully. Quote, from the shore it is hard to tell what is city and what is palace, for it all rises from the islands of the lake towards the sky in a stretch of gold. Whole neighborhoods rest on the jeweled bridges that connect the islands together. Gondolas and river ships sail along the watery avenues of its flooded lower dwellings. Moth priests walk by in a cloud of ancestors. House guards hold exceptionally long daikatanas crossed at intersections, adorned with ribbons and dragon flags. And the newly arrived Western legionaries sweat in the humid air. The river mouth is tainted red from the tinmy soil of the shore, and river dragons rust their hides in its waters. Across the lake, the Imperial City continues, merging into the villages of the southern Red River and ruins left from the interregnum. The Emperor's palace is a crown of sun rays, surrounded by his magical gardens. One garden path is known as Green Emperor Road. Here, topiaries of the heads of past emperors have been shaped by sorcery and can speak. When one must advise Tiber Septim, birds are drawn to the hedgery head, using their songs as its voice and moving its branches for the needed expressions. Did you hear that? Heads of past emperors. Tiber Septim can actively speak to the heads of past emperors who can advise him on what to do. Not to Khulakain just yet, because Khulakain is apparently in the process of being prepared by the topiary mages, as of the writing of the guide, of course. But I gotta say, this is just a beautiful image of the Imperial City, which I'm sad that we never got to see in Oblivion. But of course, we must remember that this is an idealized view of the city, and we need another perspective. YR simply writes, of course no mention of the Aldmeri citadel the capital city was built upon, or the crimes perpetrated there in the previous era. So yeah, to briefly sum up, as we can see, Cyrodiil is still the heart of the Empire, but it is much more alien than we saw it in the Elder Scrolls 4, and there is a much bigger emphasis on the divide between the East and the West. The guide also emphasizes Tiber Septim's key role in the Empire and in the world as a whole. The next chapter of the guide is about the province of High Rock. High Rock is inhabited by the Bretons, which are descendants of humans, but their lineage is not as clear as it might seem. These are actually humans who were taken by the elves as slaves in the destruction of Sarthal. I told you before that the elves killed pretty much everyone except for Ysgramor and his two sons who fled to Atmora, but they did keep some slaves, and these slaves then spent centuries under elven rule. Because of all the hard work they had to do and also the intermingling that they did with the elves, they are today basically unrecognizable. Actually, when they were first discovered by the Nords, they were mistaken for Aldmer. The guide tells us that, quote, "Indeed, the hunting party attacked them thinking they were some new strain of Aldmeri, halting their slaughter only when one of the oldest began to wail for his life, a shrieking plea that was spoken in broken Nordic." End quote. And this was actually the point at which Nords even realized who the Bretons were, what they were. This was during the reign of King Vrage, the king who started the 50-year conquest expansion. And this was actually one of his casus belli, so to speak, one of the reasons for his wars. He decided that these human cousins had to be liberated. But it wasn't going so well for him. The elves were too strong, and actually many Bretons helped them. Many Bretons sided with them in the conflict because they had known nothing but their masters all their life. So imagine that these foreigners, these foreign Nords are coming to attack you. Well, I guess you will help your masters even though they don't treat you well. So the First Empire managed to conquer the region only partially. The Bretons were fully liberated only under the rule of the Alessian Order. The Order actually lost a battle at Glenumbria Moors against the Aldmer. This was a battle which happened in year 482 of the First Era, but the Aldmeri victory was costly for them, and it weakened them. The Order managed to seize most of High Rock by the year 500. There were some exceptions, though. For example, the Western Reach stayed Elven, and the consequences of that can still very much be seen today as of the writing of the guide. Let's talk about the Bretons themselves. So it's actually a sort of generic term for various peoples who have very diverse backgrounds. They live in various city-states, principalities, baronies, duchies, kingdoms, and the province was united only recently. What does unite them is the common language and also the point at which they separated from the Nords, which, of course, is the Night of Tears, as I already said. Some of their divisions are political. For example, quote, "Bretons have fought on both sides of most of the great conflicts of Tamrielic history, including Glenumbria Moors. The memories of these victories and defeats continue to taint relations between the many factions of this divided people." End quote. Then there is the social division. There are basically three classes in High Rock. There is the peasantry and poor middle class, then the magical elite, and the nobility. The nobility is interesting because it is so complicated and the relations between the nobility are so incoherent that not even Bretons can tell their leaders from one another. Because of this steep social inequality, there is a big culture of questing, a culture of obsession with knighthood, because this is one of the few ways in which you can improve your social standing as a poor peasant. So in High Rock, you will often see young Bretons performing good deeds, hoping that this will get them elevated, this will get them knighted so that they can become nobles. When it comes to elements which unite the Bretons, there is the remarkably similar clothing, architecture, and customs. Despite the diversity of these peoples, these are actually pretty much the same in the entire province. So for example, when it comes to architecture, you will see these rustic villages, half-timber construction, noble manners. These are elements which you will find pretty much all across High Rock. Another common element is the talent for magic. So obviously this is a consequence of the elven intermingling. Humans as such don't have as much magical talent as the elves, but these human-elven descendants have quite a lot of it. In the cities, magic is overseen mostly by the mages guilds. Actually, because of the frequent magical talent, they make sure to test their children for talent at an early age, and kids who show an aptitude for magic get accepted into apprenticeship programs, or independent sponsors take them under their wings. So this is a pretty good way to improve your social standing as well. In the more remote regions, there is no mages guild, obviously. By remote regions, I mean mostly the Rotgarian Mountains and also Glen Point Island. In these regions, you will find mostly witches and medicine men, who are the main practitioners of magic among the local superstitious peasants. And despite the lack of formal training, the local children and the local mages still have often impressive abilities. Now let's look at the geography of the province. I mentioned the Rotgarian Mountains, which basically divide the western reach from the rest of the province. If you're looking to find actual cities in the province, you will only find them in the Iliac Bay, where there are actually several small kingdoms. Northwest of the bay, on the plateau of North Cambria, it's mostly small towns located in valleys. But one important feature of these plateaus are also the forts, which are apparently everywhere, and they have become quite a big problem because they often get inhabited by bandits who then terrorize the locals. So Tiber Septim has actually begun the process of demolishing them to ensure prosperity and expunge criminals. Now we'll talk about the two most important cities. Daggerfall is one of the oldest and largest cities in High Rock. The author of the guide is quick to add that it's not comparable with Cyrodiil, Windhelm, or even Sentinel, but it is still a city filled with tradition. The city was actually founded by the Nords during the First Empire, and as such, it has a long-standing tradition and is considered generally a big kingdom among the kingdoms of High Rock. Only few Nordic buildings can still be seen there to this day, though. The city also suffered the Thracian plague in the First Era, and apparently it is only now, as of the writing of the guide, beginning to recover. It is now busy competing with Wayrest for influence as a trading port. And Wayrest is our second great city. It is historically a rival of Daggerfall, and usually a weaker one at that, so it suffers a sort of inferiority complex. This manifests itself in how the locals are quick to flaunt their wealth at their ostentatious courts. The city has a shorter history than Daggerfall, but after the fall of Orsinium it has prospered immensely and has actually become the largest and richest city in High Rock currently. Now, when the province is part of the Empire, there is even more opportunity for the local merchants who are already incredibly rich. The Isle of Balfiera has historically served as a neutral meeting place, respected by pretty much all the factions across High Rock. It is also significant because it is the site of the Direni Tower, also known as the Adamantium Tower. This is basically a huge circular tower, hundreds of feet tall apparently, and it looks like a smooth cylinder made of shining metal. It is also believed to extend hundreds of feet underground as well as above ground, and I say believed because it was actually never fully explored. Even though there are archaeological investigations ongoing there, the structure is just so huge that nobody quite knows how deep it goes. And nobody also knows why it's even there, what was its purpose, who built it and why. It is estimated that it was constructed around the year 2500 of the Merethic era, that is the era even before the First Era, and as such it is the oldest structure on Tamriel by far. It currently serves as the home of the Castellan of Balfiera, which is like the local overseer of the island. Interestingly enough, this is hereditarily a high elf, which makes him the only elven ruler in human lands. Finally, we gotta talk about the region of Western Reach, which is of course located next to Skyrim's western border. We already heard about the Eastern Reach in the Skyrim section of the guide. During the First Empire, the Western Reach was one of the Empire's holds, but after the Empire fell, it was retaken by the Aldmeri. All the local Nords were slaughtered, and it has actually spent the longest time under Elven rule out of all the regions of High Rock. A remarkable human race lives there known as the Reachmen. Quote, "The Reachmen are a Mongol breed, even for Bretons. Descended originally from one of the earliest Atmoran tribes to settle Tamriel, their lineage now partakes of nearly every race imaginable." End quote. The guide then identifies arrogance as their chief trait and ascribes it to their elven blood. They also have a talent for the so-called wild magic, which is basically an umbrella term for all magic not sanctioned by the Mages Guild, and they got this talent from the orcs because they tend to trade with them. The wild magic or the reach magic, it's actually banned by the Mages Guild because the guild obviously likes its monopoly on magic, and so the Reachmen are also called the Witchmen of High Rock. Other than that, the Western Reach region is full of bandits, and it is currently overseen by a provisional governor from the Colovian army. YR observes here that, quote, "Colovian officers have traditionally been appointed as provincial governors to the human regions of the empire, as these often need the most forthright of the emperor's men." End quote. And with that, we have come to the conclusion of the High Rock chapter. Some elements that stand out to me: the classic fantasy tropes here are, I would say, much more significant than in the other regions of Tamriel. You have the quest obsession of young Bretons, you have classic medieval architecture and castles, you have this sort of magic. It all feels quite classic fantasy to me, but there's also enough to make it stand out. And obviously the cultural division, the human-elven origin of the Bretons, and just the overall diversity, I think is something to keep in mind when thinking about this province. And now we are moving on to Hammerfell, the province of the Red Guards. Hammerfell is often considered exotic, or full of barbarians and cutthroats, and as we go through this chapter, I think you will come to understand why. Before we get to the Red Guards though, in the history of Hammerfell, the dwarves actually played quite an important role as well, so we gotta talk about them. The Dwemer first came to Hammerfell from Morrowind. This was the Rurken clan of Morrowind, or Resdayn, which refused to make peace with the Dunmer and decided to move elsewhere. What their chieftain did is he just threw a hammer into the air and he decided to travel wherever it should land. And it landed in today's Hammerfell, which for this reason was then called by the dwarves Vollenfell, meaning City of the Hammer. This is of course a popular origin myth in the region, so you will often find it illustrated on the walls of ruins, for example. By the way, in this section of the guide, we get a brief paragraph about whether the Dwemer should actually be called the dwarves. The author of the pocket guide tells us that the name dwarves doesn't really make any sense, because they were obviously as tall as all Aldmeric races. It's enough to just see their armor in the ruins, you realize that they must have been really tall. And the guide tells us that, quote, imperial excavation supports the theory that the translation of Dwemer as deep elves might instead be read as smart elves, despite the incongruity of that notion, end quote. Of course, YR feels the need to comment on that. Characteristic human logic. Why would any self-respecting Mer refer to himself as a dwarf, even if it were a name given by the blessed Earthbones? Obsessed with anatomy they are. It does not even occur to them that stature may refer to things outside of the physical. So much for the Dwemer in Hammerfell. Now let's get to the Red Guards. The Red Guards are originally from the continent of Yakuda, which is west of Tamriel, but about 3,000 years ago, as of the writing of the guide, it sunk, and the Red Guards were forced to evacuate it. They decided to go to Tamriel, and while the bulk of the Red Guard population stayed on the Isle of Herne waiting, their warriors went to the mainland to conquer a piece of the land for the Red Guards. These warriors were back then called Ragada, which is actually where we get the name Red Guards from, because since these were the only ones that Tamrielic peoples had any contact with, they sort of came to apply this name to the entire race, and by phonetically adapting it to their languages, they came to call this people Red Guards. So the Ragada invaded the lands, they would slaughter the local beast folk and needs, and they actually came to find a lot of success in the land. Their society was better organized, they had more advanced agriculture, for example, so they completely replaced the Nedic race. But somewhat paradoxically, they actually adopted many of the local customs. For example, the religious customs, or even the language. Their original language, Yoku, was almost entirely replaced, because they needed to trade with the other races to prosper, and so they gradually came to adopt their ways as well. Even later on, they came into contact with Bretons and Colovians, and their assimilation into Tamriel was pretty much complete. During the era of the Second Empire, two parties became firmly established. I say parties because under the Second Empire, Hammerfell came to be almost like a republic. The two main parties were the Crowns and the Forebears. The Crowns were formed by the Nato Tambu, the traditional ruling class of the Red Guards, whereas the Forebears represented the warrior Ragada. This was a new development because it was only under the Second Empire that the Ragada actually were granted the rights of ownership and were sort of empowered so as to not be directly subordinate to the ruling class. But when both the Riemann dynasty and the Akaviri potentate in the empire fell, the political system changed in Hammerfell as well. The Nato Tambu took back control of the province, they elected their own high king, and they once again established their power, and they were so successful that they even dared move the throne from Old Hagath back to Sentinel. Sentinel was the city of Forebears, the opposing faction, and it was actually quite a prosperous city because it controlled a third of the trade in Iliac Bay. But their power was so great that they could afford to move back here despite it being the city of the opposing faction, and it was not until the death of the last High King in the year 862 of the Second Era that the forebears retook Sentinel. The son of the last High King decided to wage war on the forebears to take revenge, but when the forebears asked the Emperor Tiber Septim for help, he did help them and Aetor was defeated in the Battle of Hunding Bay. The author then states, quote, "The Emperor, in his wisdom, deemed it best to assume responsibility for Hammerfell's lawful restoration as a republic and provincial territory, where presently the Redguards spend their days as proud subjects of the new Cyrodiilic Empire." End quote. This is of course quite the optimistic account from someone who wants to portray the human provinces as mutually harmonic, and YR tells us two quite different things about this. He says, first, that the most formidable of all the ills that threaten the future of the Empire arises from the presence of the Redguards within its provinces. And second, he also tells us that the ship of my passage was captured by pirates calling themselves the Restless League. They threw over crates from the cargo hold, crates full of arms meant for the Empire at Stros Mackay, and they robbed everyone aboard, though their leader, after seeing this, my annotated pamphlet, and guessing my intent, let me keep it, telling me, "We must not act and speak as if asleep." So here we can clearly see that there is a faction of the Redguards determined to oppose the Empire, which the author of the guide of course completely neglects to mention. And I feel like I should also say that this is direct story setup for The Elder Scrolls Adventures Redguard, which is the game that this pocket guide was sort of released with. So this is why we get a bit more specific details here, maybe. Now let's talk about the Redguards themselves as a race. The author tells us, quote, "The Redguards can be intimidating to an outsider, with their dark skin and woolly hair, tall gaunt frames and finely toned physique. In demeanor they are haughty and easily provoked, and to the last obsessed with personal honor." End quote. Although the Redguards are skilled warriors, they severely lack discipline, and this seems to be the main reason why Hammerfell has no standing army. And indeed, there aren't many Redguards even serving in the Imperial Ruby ranks. They do often serve the royals as knights though, and they are definitely not afraid to fight. To prove their mettle, they often have to undergo dangerous tests of skill, and we get a brief account of two of those tests. Quote, "The youths of Crown Totambu, for example, must sail to the Dwemer ruins of Stros Mackay to avoid its death traps and wrestle its mechanical men back into shape before they can join the Knights of the Scarab. The more severe Order of Diagna, on the other hand, stages an annual recreation of the Siege of Orsinium, where their initiates must play the part of the orcs." End quote. So there seems to be quite a bit of diversity with these tests of skill, but they are all dangerous. As for Redguard fashion, it seems to be quite diverse across the region, very much unlike what we saw in High Rock. So for example, in Elinhir, the fashion is almost Colovian, but in Rihad you will often meet Redguards wearing nothing at all. This is also tied into their religious rituals, which we will talk about in a moment. Geographically, the province is barren and rocky, so it is once again quite sharply divided between the tribes living in the wilderness and the city dwellers. Now, the wilderness is obviously represented by the huge desert Alik'r, which is approximately in the center of the province. The local nomadic tribes were often influenced by Nidic or Yokudan traditions, and there are also many devotees of Satakal. This is the serpent god of the Redguards. This is quite a controversial religious stance and the source of many wars with the states which neighbor the desert. Quote, "These revered madmen depend entirely on the charity of the other Redguards, though sometimes they rise in perilous bands, terrorizing the countryside in old Ragada fashion. Many, as in Rihad, go nude, rolling around in the dirt and nipping at the legs of passerby, striking out as if they were snakes themselves, while others perform terrible exhibitions of shedding their skin. They have been seen rolling in the desert sand sidewinder fashion in continuous 100-mile stretches from Balhar all the way to the Nohotogra oasis." End quote. The devotees of Satakal tend to dislike the Empire immensely. This manifests itself, for example, by them hitting their civil servants when they meet them, so it comes as a no surprise that they were banned from entering the cities. On the coasts of Hammerfell we will find a few grasslands, so this is where we should look for the cosmopolitan cities. I say cosmopolitan because they are often Breton or imperial in their architecture, in their fashion, although both those things tend to be modified with motifs from old Yokuda. Even the Redguard gods were reorganized to fit into the 8 divines. But here, YR sharply disagrees with what the author of the guide alleges. YR says, "Hardly. The Red Guards tolerate worship of Archais, Zenithar, and Kinnereth because they approximate certain agriculture deities brought over from Yakuda. Most of the other imperial gods are disregarded as Tobra, useless, thus evil. End quote. As for the few cities and towns outside Iliac Bay, these are visited rarely because they have quite a dangerous reputation, a reputation for intolerance of outlanders. Emperor Tiber Septim, though, seems to want to change that. And to explain why, the author tells us, quote, Hammerfell itself is a beautiful country. From the twin moonrises over the Alikor Shade temples to the austere ramparts of Old Hagath, everywhere there is the appearance of antique splendor. Its people are harsh. 400 years of internal conflict and corrupt government have made them so, but taken singly, the Red Guard is often a masterful work of a man. End quote. As for the important places of Hammerfell, we definitely need to mention Sentinel. The inhabitants of this city are mostly merchants. They kind of have to be, because it's located on rocky hills, with no opportunities for agriculture. The Sentinel Palace is actually the oldest and largest Red Guard monument. It was built quite quickly back in the day to ward against the Bretons, but it's been added to ever since and has grown to be a truly remarkable monument. The city of Sentinel serves as an exotic retreat for nobles from Daggerfell and Wayrest over in High Rock. I say exotic because it has several distinguishing features: the tasty cuisine, the local craftsmanship, and the, quote, bizarre morality plays in the Royal Theatre. The city is also the seat of power of the provisional governor of the province. I say provisional because he came to power after the disappearance of Baron Volag, who sparked the original war between crowns and forebears. Another important place is the island of Stros Mackay. This formerly belonged to the Crown Prince Aetor, but is now the seat of power of the provisional governor. It's a small and unassuming island, but it has a strategic location near the Cape of the Blue Divide, which is close to the waters of Aldmeri Dominion. So, to recap, the province of Hammerfell is quite exotic and dangerous. I think both of those things are quite well represented by the religious practices of the Satakal devotees, for example. And it is also the least loyal of the human provinces, the least loyal to the Empire, that is. Now, since I decided to limit the scope of this video to the Pocket Guide to the Empire, I will not talk about what happens in Redguard, the game, but this would definitely be an interesting subject as well. Okay, let's move on to the next region. We are moving beyond the borders of the Empire because the next region that we will talk about is actually the Empire's main enemy. The Aldmeri Dominion is a state composed of the Somerset Isles and Valenwood. Until now, we've talked about human provinces, so the author of the Pocket Guide to the Empire obviously was more biased in favor of these races, but now this is essentially their main enemy. We will be getting a highly biased account in the other direction. And of course we have YR to help us identify the most egregious lies, although he will be a bit less helpful than you might expect. So the Aldmeri Dominion used to be two independent states, so the Somerset Isles and Valenwood, and this has changed quite recently. They joined together in the year 830 of the Second Era, so only 34 years before the release of this guide. This was the result of the recent fighting over the throne of Valenwood. Long ago, the Camoran dynasty used to rule the province, or, well, the region, I guess. It used to rule it until the Thracian plague came around, and its heirs are still around today, so they began fighting over the throne again. But there was also a Bosmer faction which supported their own candidate, and the only way they saw that they could actually get them on the throne was to offer peace to Colovia in exchange for their help. Now, Colovia used to be their longtime enemies, and the Altmer used this as a reason to invade Valenwood to ostensibly protect it. They established a provisional government called the Thalmor. And they did all this to support Camoran Anaximes, the heir of the Camoran dynasty. They managed to repel the Colovians. By the way, I'm only speaking of the Colovians because this was during the interregnum when the empire wasn't united, so the Colovians had to fight them all alone. So they established a provisional government because the condition for this help was that the King of Elinor, which is the capital city of the Somerset Isles, would rule Valenwood for the next 50 years. And this is how the Aldmeri Dominion was born. Now, what I just gave you is the imperial account, and YR comments on this simply by saying, quote, I don't know where to begin pointing out the lies, end quote. Which is not very helpful. I mean, it would definitely be interesting to hear more about what these lies are exactly, but right now we only have this information to go by. Now that the Empire is unified, the Aldmeri are wary to attack it. They are trying to keep their distance. The Imperial author writes, quote, "On the occasions when the elves probed the Empire's defenses, the legions have sent them back in tatters. Indeed, the Colovians have taken to calling their enemy the Aldmeri Dominion for the womanly offensives of its Sylvan soldiers. The situation at sea, however, is another story, and the Dominion terrorizes the southern wastes from the Cape of the Blue Divide to the Topal Bay." End quote. Now, judging by the amount of exclamation marks that YR writes after this sentence, I guess he's not too happy with this account of what's happening. We can clearly see the double standard because on the one hand they are criticizing the Dominion's offensive for being weak, and on the other, when the Dominion is successful on the sea, the Imperial author says that they are terrorizing them. So that's Imperial propaganda for you. Now obviously, since the Empire is unified, the Aldmeri need allies of their own, and they have apparently allied themselves with some Reachmen, Maormer of Pyandonia, and maybe, because the Imperial author isn't sure of this, maybe the Elsweyr Confederacy. So essentially Tamriel is divided between the Empire and the Elder races, although that is a bit of a simplification. Even the author of the guide admits here that the Imperials don't know much about the Mer as a whole, with the exception of Morrowind, which is somewhat better known because of its history under the First Nordic Empire and its openness to trade during the Second Era. But the other elven races are known only from brief imperial occupations or the occasional elven literature. And there is an interesting little paragraph about the scarcity of elven writings, because the Alessian Order actually destroyed most elven writings, which is why the Empire has so few of them today. Only the Annuad was left, and a few other important works which were too widespread to destroy all the copies. But some of the writings are protected by magical means, for example the mysterious writings of the Direni, and we have a quote here from an early human scholar called Ilzexes. "Hidden magic is everywhere incorporated in their writings, signs and preternatural runes and correspondences, in expenditure columns even, or margins that can be fatal to the uninitiated. Crucial pages were covered with the spittle of the previous translator who had babbled idiotically over the text for days before catching fire." So decoding those writings can be quite the challenge, and information on the Somerset Isles and the Altmer as a whole is especially rare. During the Second Empire, ambassadors from the Empire were only allowed in the city of Alinor. Because of this, pretty much the only human source when it comes to the Altmer is Eric of Guy, Riemann's emissary who spent many years there. He writes, "High elves consider themselves to be the only perfect race. Over hundreds of generations they have bred themselves into a racially pure line and are now almost identical to one another in appearance. The theory that the High Elves do not reproduce as quickly or as often as humans is false. Rather, and to my horror, they kill 9 out of 10 babies born to them in their obsession for purity." He then goes on to write about how the Altmer are supremely arrogant and despise even the other elves, and how they prize order and purity above all else. He believed that the only reason they were even willing to pay imperial tithes was to, quote, "keep an invasion from infecting their lands," end quote. Under their culture of selective breeding, breaking purity is a complete taboo, a crime, and if an Altmer is punished by exile to the mainland, it's treated as equivalent to a death sentence, because there is no life outside the Somerset Isles. Quote, "They have no real names of their own, only combinations of numbers that, when spoken aloud, sound to human ears as such. They feel no real tenderness for one another and have no concept of compassion. They are decadent and self-obsessed, and prize form and their own brand of manners or style as their main value. Aware of their aristocratic position, they surround themselves with riches and treasures, the works of great artists and the finest of everything, but have no real appreciation for any of these things. Each of them is concerned solely with himself, and as a result they do no real socializing. They meet and hold courts only to demonstrate their importance and power to each other. Rarely do they speak to the human ambassadors of Cyrodiil, When they do, their speech is full of riddles or spell words that enchant one to a satisfied madness." End quote. The city of Eleanor, the only one that humans were ever allowed to visit, is described as, quote, "made from glass or insect wings," end quote. A description from the era of the Riemann dynasty reads, "A hypnotic swirl of ramparts and impossibly high towers, designed to catch the light of the sun and break it to its component colors, which lies draped across its stones until you are thankful for nightfall." To me, this description sounds quite beautiful, but it's obvious that the human authors are not inclined to view it as such. Now let's talk about the second part of the Aldmeri Dominion, the region of Valenwood. The vast majority of this region is covered by dense mangroves. On the coast there are rainforests, and grasslands or glades are few and far between. You wouldn't even find many roads here, since the Second Empire built only a few of them, and the Wood Elves have no real inclination to maintain them. They don't really need them. It's easy for them to travel through thick forests. That being said, they are maintained at the moment because of the Aldmer. There are very few humans to be found in the region. The trading posts left over from the Second Empire are now inhabited by centaurs, orcs, or Imga. Let's talk about these Imga because they are quite an interesting race. They are native to the region of Valenwood. What characterizes them is a complete obsession with the Aldmer. They worship the Aldmer, they worship their ways, and they do their utmost to emulate them. Listen to this, quote, "Great apes go to desperate measures to emulate the High Elves. They wear capes, practice with the dueling sword, and attempt to speak with perfect enunciation and courtly manners, despite their gravelly baritone voices. Each Imga bears some kind of title, be it Baron, Duke, Earl, or the like, which they use when addressing the members of the Thalmor. Needless to say, there are no landowning great apes. More extreme great apes shave their bodies and powder their skin white to seem more like the High Elves. They often cut themselves in the process, creating the truly pathetic picture of a naked white ape, skin dotted pink with blood, strutting around the trading posts of Valenwood with mock nobility." End quote. Just like the Aldmer, they highly disrespect the humans, and in fact, if there are any humans around, they shame them by pretending that they cannot bear the smell. But the majority inhabitants of Valenwood are obviously the native Wood Elves, and here we have to again turn to Eric of Gie. Apparently the Wood Elves have built no real settlements, and there's a very simple reason for that. They haven't really learned how to use stone to construct anything, and they are prohibited from using wood or vegetable by the Green Pact. This is a sort of religious or cultural taboo that they adhere to very seriously. There are loopholes around this. For example, they are still permitted to buy wood products from other races, and they can also sell wood from the Valenwood region to others. It's just that they themselves cannot chop down trees or destroy vegetation. This leads them to another of their doctrines, which is the meat mandate. Their diet has to be exclusively carnivorous. That's right, they can only eat animals, or imported meat, or beast folk, or their enemies, or even each other, which they indeed do. And this has a significant impact on how they operate with the other races. Because the meat mandate also states that, quote, "a fallen enemy must be eaten completely before 3 days pass," end quote. So imagine how much this impacts the logistics of war. The Bosmer don't really like large battles, and they have to prepare for them by fasting so that they can actually manage this. When it comes to fighting, they are great archers, but since they cannot use wood to construct their bows, they must use bone, or they must buy bows from other cultures. They also like to use bone pipes to smoke insects. They have a natural talent for stealth. Eric of Gie tells us that, quote, "For a brief time the Colovian armies used Wood Elf archers, as in the War of Riha 2 years past. The Bosmer proved to be too undisciplined and prone to desertion for further use. They would sometimes walk into the shade of a single tree and vanish. Their forest coupling skills are remarkable. The title of their most famous poem, the Me Elidion, means the 1,000 benefits of hiding." A sort of quirky trait of theirs is their fascination with carpentry products, which, of course, they themselves cannot make. When they visit another province and see carpentry products there, they have a tendency to buy those things even if they don't really need them, and they don't even care how to properly use them. So there are, for example, accounts of Bosmer using wagon wheels as shields or hats. But far from being just quirky, they also have a bestial side. Quote, "They can resort to animal shapes if they need to, or water. Their most dreaded transformation is the Wild Hunt, which killed King Borgus for the iniquities of his Alessian faith. The Wild Hunt is a pack of shifting forest demons and animal gods, thousands strong, which sweeps through the countryside, killing everything in its path. End quote. Now, the Bosmer don't like to talk about the hunt. They seem to see it as a necessary evil. Necessary because it dispenses justice, but still an evil, and they are terrified by it. By the way, just because the Bosmer construct no settlements doesn't mean that there aren't remarkable places to visit. And one of the most important is Falinesti. This is the seat of the Bosmer king, and it is basically a walking city, a city that walks, a city that is in the south in summer and in the north in winter. Now, by city, I basically mean a giant tree, because Falinesti is in fact the largest of the Grat oaks of Valenwood. There are countless elves living in this place, climbing its branches up and down, also many Imga and orcs, but you would be hard-pressed to find a human there because humans just find it too unsettling. But as of the writing of the guide, the capital of Valenwood is actually Eldenroot. The Thalmor moved it there for the duration of the Dominion. Concluding the section about the Aldmeri Dominion, the author of the guide advises humans to avoid the Dominion, avoid their books and their magic, and he writes that even though the Thalmor have their representatives in the Imperial City and Zurin Arctus is meeting with the King of Eleanor, the relations are still strained and, especially the Altmer, are dangerous, so he urges the readers to join the Legion. It is also here that we learn from YR that many Thalmor are for non-interventionism, but there is also a significant faction of those who want to wage open war against the Empire. The Aldmeri Dominion is definitely the most mysterious region so far, and there isn't really much for us to go on, but what is there is extremely interesting, I would say. This section of the guide is probably the most open to interpretation because of how biased both our sources are when it comes to this topic specifically. Okay, that was the Aldmeri Dominion. Now, let's talk about the Elsweyr Confederacy. Elsweyr is actually the youngest region here in the guide if we don't count the Aldmeri Dominion, because it was established in the Second Era as the only one of the regions that we are talking about today. More specifically, it was established in the 3rd century of the Second Era. Geographically, it is described as a harsh area of badlands and dry plains. It is covered in jungle and rainforests with sugarcane groves in the south. Fertile soil can only be found in the far south, the area known as Palatine. The northern part of Elsweyr is known as Anequina, and it is remarkable because despite its close position to Cyrodiil and the other provinces, it has never in the history of Tamriel threatened Nords or the empires. The author of the guide writes that, quote, "Indeed, Pelinal Whitestrake, Nibene warlord of the Elven pogrom, mistook the Khajiit for another strain of Aldmeri and killed many of their number before realizing his error." It seems to me that this was quite a common occurrence for Nord warlords. Let's talk about the peoples of Elsweyr, because they are absolutely fascinating. So, Elsweyr is of course inhabited by the Khajiit, and what is most remarkable about the Khajiit are their diverse forms. Every Khajiit is essentially different. Quote, "A particular family tribe, or pride, might include a hunting party of males that appear like upright jaguars, a few beautiful youths who could pass for elves, were it not for their swishing tails, an uncle or two that would stalk the perimeters on all fours, and a chief who, depending on the moons of his birth, might have the form of any of the above." And yes, the forms of the Khajiit are determined by the configuration of the moons. The twin moons Masr and Secunda are called by the Khajiit Jakage, which translates to moon strings or lunar lattice. And they are basically their god. Based on the configuration of the moons, when the Khajiit is born, they can be born as one of many different forms. The guide gives us the examples of jaguar men, these are the Kathairat, intelligent house cats, which we know from other sources are called Alfik, the largest cat in existence, called here the Senche tiger, and the man-faced Khajiit, the Ohms. The Ohms are actually the most common form outside of the province of Elsweyr, apparently because they are often adventurers and serve as diplomats. Now, if you played Morrowind, you will realize that this was not the case in that game. In fact, all the Khajiit on Vardenfell were Soothsayrat, so this makes me think Bethesda writers changed their minds between Redguard and Morrowind. Either way, there are over 20 documented forms of the Khajiit, What is really remarkable is that all are inherently equal. You might expect maybe the weaker forms to be treated as lesser and the stronger forms as better than the weaker forms, but this is absolutely not the case. All Khajiit are inherently equal, and I wonder if this has something to do with the fact that two parents of a form might have a child of any of the other forms, so there is no real way to reliably predict what form your offspring will even be. The only exception to this complete equality is the mane. This is a completely unique form of the Khajiit. There is only one mane at the time, and the mane serves as the spiritual leader of the Khajiit, as we will shortly see. Quote, "On the whole, the catmen of Elsweyr are a bestial lot, victims of their own preternatural anatomies. They are quick to anger, unpredictable, and dangerous, though singly no match for an Imperial Legionnaire. It is also worthwhile to point out that the so-called human features found among many of the Khajiits are in fact distinctly elven in appearance, no doubt proving once and for all the baser predilections of the elder race." End quote. I'm not quite sure why I chose to share this quote, since it was on the whole just more imperial propaganda, but I think it's helpful to illustrate how the Khajiit are viewed by the humans, and this might help explain some of their alleged decisions, which we will come to see later. Despite this dismissal of the Khajiit race, when it comes to the culture of Elsweyr, the human author calls it a close approximation of modern human culture, which is perhaps their attempt at explaining why the culture isn't as primitive as they probably expected. The Khajiit tend to wear brightly patterned shawls for protection from sun and sharp blades. They actually have strict rules about clothing, since torso fur is expected to be covered, and if you're walking around with your torso bare, it's considered indecent. Tattoos are popular among the Khajiit, and they can actually have religious or legal meaning. In the case of young Ohms, however, which you will remember is the form most similar to the elves, these actually just like to tattoo their faces so that they look more like the Khajiit, so that they are not mistaken for elves. When it comes to warfare, Khajiit like to fight with their claws, but also sabers, scimitars, daggers, or longbows. Despite how fearsome they have no army, and the Khajiit have actually historically never been much interested in expansion. In fact, during the last 50 years before the writing of the guide, they have actually lost territories, as we will see. Khajiiti religion, as I said, is based on the worship of the lunar lattice, or the Jacage. Every breed actually worships its own phase of moons, the phase of moons that they were born under. So each form of the Khajiit actually has their own gods, although they are more like aspects of the one god that is Maser and Secunda. The human author tells us that the lunar gods are just divines in disguise, and cites the examples of Stendar, Mara, and Kinnareth, who apparently have clear equivalents in the Khajiiti culture. Interestingly enough, YR has no annotation here. I half expected him to dispute this for some reason, but it seems that this is either the case, or YR just isn't really interested in disputing lies about the Elsweyr Confederacy because he's not as much invested in it. The Khajiit also have the concept of Drom Athra, which are these dark spirits which vaguely correspond to the Daedra. Another important part of the Khajiiti religion is moon sugar. This is a substance native to the Tenmar forest, which is found in southern Elsweyr, and it is also the chief export of the province. It is a useful substance because it can serve as seasoning or a magical ingredient, but of course most of us remember it as an addictive drug. The Khajiit, however, believe it to be a blessing from the gods, which is why I'm talking about it in the religion section. According to Khajiiti belief, it is, quote, the crystallized moonlight caught in the water of the Topal Sea and brought to the sugarcane groves of the Tenmar by the force of the twin tides, end quote. Actually, the Khajiit believe that moon sugar are small portions of their gods' eternal souls, so when they consume moon sugar, they are essentially eating their gods. Now, the addictiveness of moon sugar is caused by the fits of ecstasy that it induces when consumed, and apparently even streets of major cities are full of Khajiit shivering in ecstasy. Moon sugar is, of course, also the principal ingredient to produce skooma. This is an even more dangerous derivative, which is smoked through water pipe, and those who get addicted to skooma are usually addicted for life. Their life is then essentially a cycle of euphoria and lethargy. Euphoria after they've consumed their favorite drug, and lethargy when they are deprived of it. Just to complete this little section, I might also mention that Khajiiti prefer sweet food in general. In their cuisine you will find candy, cakes, and puddings. And the author of the guide writes, quote, Travelers to Elsweyr are cautioned against partaking of any of the native food. Humans, it seems, are even more susceptible to the effects of the moon sugar than the catmen themselves." End quote. Now let's briefly talk about the history of Elsweyr. We don't actually get to hear much of it, because most of Khajiiti history is apparently just this jumble of constant warfare between the many different Khajiiti tribes. And just as a reminder, these tribes are not based on race. Every tribe has representatives of every race. But this constant warfare ends in the year 309 of the Second Era, when the king of Anequina, the northern section of Elsweyr, and the queen of Palatine, the southern section, get married. These two kingdoms were traditionally very hostile, but now for the first time they were combined into one state. This, however, led to a great class struggle, because the individual tribes felt betrayed by the nobles, and they began planning to overthrow them. During this period, Anequina was pretty much under constant attack, and the empire couldn't help because it was also unstable. It had just lost its ruler. We can see that this is quite a common pattern to most of the regions of Tamriel. It seems that the empire really was effective as a unifying force, and when it crumbled, a lot of provinces went into disarray. The conflict really escalated when the old capital of Nequinal fell to the rebels, and it took the Main to finally solve this conflict once and for all. This was Main Rit Haridata, who, I gotta say, solved this in a pretty smart way. He essentially divided the power equally between the two warring classes, and decided that they would trade places in the leadership so that each class ruled for an equal amount of time. And this rotation would be determined by the configuration of the Jacage itself. So now there is really no way to try to overthrow the government, because you are essentially going against the gods. Now, this exchange of power would essentially be supervised by the Main himself, so the Empire tends to view this as a thinly veiled dictatorship of the Main. But nevertheless, it seems to be quite effective. However, this was 500 years before the writing of this guide, and since then, the Imperial author has learned nothing. The Empire has no idea what Elsweyr is up to. The Elsweyr Confederacy has completely secluded itself from the rest of Tamriel, and nobody knows what is going on. Now, here we get a little annotation by YR, although I'm not sure if this wasn't a mistake. It seems to me like this would make more sense if it was written by the Imperial author, but you be the judge of that. Quote, "Human relations have been minimal in the intervening years, but there is talk that the Elsweyr Confederacy has recently struck treaty with the Aldmeri Dominion, a situation that, if true, may force the Catman into another bloody confrontation with the Cyrodiilic masters of Tamriel." End quote. Well, maybe it makes sense as something YR would write, since he hasn't been in contact with the Thalmor, so he might not know what's going on. Either way, it is very interesting. As for the most notable places in Elsweyr, there is Senchal. This is the largest port in southern Tamriel, and it is also the center of illegal trades. It's a hub of smugglers and pirates who thrive here, because this is the best place to smuggle goods in and out of the Empire. If you were to go inland, over the sea, that would not be as safe. The sea is simply too guarded, but this is a pretty secure way to smuggle goods. And because of that, you will also find thieves, beggars, and sugar junkies here. The Imperial author mentions Black Kirgo, which is supposed to be a particularly dangerous quarter. And to complete the picture, let me read you a lengthy quote. "Illicit sugar dens line the streets here, where beastmen and nobility alike wither away in sucrose fevers. All in all, Senchal is the ugliest city outside of Imperial jurisdiction. The air is humid and full of the chimney smoke caught in the eddies from the surrounding coasts. Much of the city is abandoned or in ruins. In Common Era 560, a strain of the Nahatan flu blew across the channel from nearby Argonia and quickly infected the city's population. Whole neighborhoods were razed in some mad effort to cleanse Senchal of the flu and have never been rebuilt. Visitors to the open-air markets can see these charred skylines on the periphery, as black and jagged as the teeth of the nearest sugar junkie begging for cake." The atmosphere of the next place we will talk about is completely different. The city of Torval is the home of the Main, the spiritual and now also the political leader of the Khajiit. The Main lives in exotic palaces built from Valenwood oaks and spends his days meditating atop his palanquin, carried by the strong Khajiit form of Kathairat. Humans have traditionally been forbidden from entering this place, same as they have been from entering the Tenmar forest. Quote, "An imperial diplomat was not long ago chased from the premises, even though he had been promised an audience with the Khajiit ruler. The panther-like warrior guard hissed at his approach, bared their fangs, and threatened him to leave quickly, lest they leak his sugar into the sand." End quote. Now, this might possibly be evidence of the alleged Elsweyr alliance with the Dominion, but we're not sure. The last place we will talk about is Rimmen. Rimmen outwardly presents itself as its own kingdom because it seceded from the Main in the year 812 of the Second Era. The origin of Rimmen is quite interesting. Atrebus, one of the imperial pretenders during the interregnum, decided to exile the Akaviri, and the Khajiit were kind enough to grant them asylum. The Akaviri then built their own city on the rim of Elsweyr and became literally the Rim Men. However, when the remaining Akaviri in Cyrodiil decided to try and take the throne away from the pretenders, the Rim Men joined them. But they failed, and the Khajiit then tried to reclaim their lands in a series of bloody wars. These conflicts were apparently quite complicated, so all that we know is that after the rise of Tiber Septim, the Rim Men decided to seek the protection of the Main and now pay him tribute. That's it for the province of Elsweyr. I gotta say, this province is almost as mysterious as the Somerset Isles, mostly because of the 500 years of silence and the alleged alliance with the Dominion. Its culture and inhabitants are also very exotic, although geographically it seems a bit reminiscent of Cyrodiil. Now we will move on to a province which most of us know very well. Now let's talk about everyone's favorite province, Morrowind. Morrowind used to be part of the First Empire of the Nords, as we established in the chapter on Skyrim, but is now an independent region. Because of its history, it has various names. The Nordic name is Dunmereth. You will remember that the Nords called Tamriel Mereth because of the elves that inhabited it, so Dunmereth feels appropriate. The Dunmeri name for Morrowind, however, used to be Resdain, and after the first eruption of the Red Mountain, it came to be known as Morrowind. Morrowind is obviously characterized as a completely unique land, unlike anything else in Tamriel. Its sky is uncharacteristically dark because of the ash storms from Red Mountain. Its flora is bizarre also because of the ash storms. Only plants which are able to survive the ash can thrive in Morrowind. Its creatures are very insect-like. The guide tells us that they are either domesticated, or some of them are also used for transport, which of course was referring to the Silt Striders from the game. And one more thing which unfortunately sets Morrowind apart from the other provinces are the slaves, which can be found almost everywhere. The guide notes that most of the slaves are Argonian or Khajiit, but there are also human slaves. The inhabitants of Morrowind, the Dunmer, are characterized as savage and proud. Actually, they are characterized as arrogant even for elves. They seem to view humans as absolute beasts completely beneath them. And even for the other elves, they view them as fallen and decadent. YR actually agrees with this. He says, quote, "For once I agree with this scribe. The tone of my visit was set at the frontier when I was questioned by 3 swaggering Chapthil, called me ill-bred to my face as if I knew no Dunmeri, and had not even the courtesy to call me by my full name. Despite everything, I cannot help but think that the seasoned under human rule would temper Dunmeri arrogance to a most salutary degree." End quote. This arrogance manifests itself in the fact that they completely avoid contact with the outside world, including other elves. The lineage of the Dunmer is, from the point of view of the Imperials, unclear. They seem to be related to other elves, but how exactly? Really, the earliest human sources are Nordic sagas and chronicles. The Nords in those days used to fight the Dunmer, of course, but the Dunmeri nation was founded about 3,500 years ago. So the origins of the elves are pretty much a mystery to the Imperials, and as we will see, the fact that we have played Morrowind means that we actually know a lot more about some aspects of the province than the Imperial writer here. Physically, the Dunmer have a distinct ash-grey skin and glowing red eyes, and as for the clothing that they prefer to wear, it is described as mostly light armor from insect carapaces. They wear turbans and resin goggles to protect themselves from ash and complete this with loose trousers. However, when they are inside their tents or houses, they swap this practical gear for richly colored fabrics, which often bears symbols of their clans, or even cumbersome ceremonial costumes. When it comes to the history of the province, we have to talk both about Dwarven and Dunmer history. The two don't seem to have had much interaction from what we know. Let's start with the Dwarves. Not much is known about their history. During the Nord conquest of Morrowind, there used to be a dwarven kingdom situated somewhere in the north of the province, about where the volcano is now. This kingdom actually gave Vvardenfell its name, since this word means in Dwemerish, City of the Strong Shield. However, because the kingdom was so well fortified and also hidden, it kept its independence from the Nords. Then, at some other point in history, the Dwemer disappeared. The Imperial author posits that they might have been destroyed by the volcano, but then of course goes on to say that the Dwemer disappeared everywhere, all at once, for reasons completely unknown to anyone. Either way, the city is now hopelessly lost. From YR's annotation, we also learn here that Tiber Septim is inexplicably very interested in Dwemer artifacts. I wonder what that could be about. As for the Dunmer, even the first accounts portray them as deeply divided people. They used to be divided into those petty clans, which would constantly fight against each other, and in fact would strike bargains with Nord chieftains to get at their Dunmer enemies. Now this obviously definitely helped the Nords in their conquest of Morrowind and made it much easier. However, during the War of Succession, when the Nords were divided, the Dunmer were able to unite and drive them out of Morrowind, and it was effectively the Dark Elves who ended the First Empire in this way. Then, some 2 centuries later, the Tribunal appears. The Tribunal came to power after the first eruption of Vvardenfell, when half of Morrowind was completely wasted and the population had to largely move south, somewhere to the region of Deshan Plains. Under the guidance of the Tribunal cult, the clans have united and have formed one nation, but there is still a lot of rivalry today. The Tribunal, of course, are the 3 living gods of Morrowind: Almalexia, Sothasil, and Vivec, who, interestingly enough, in this guide is spelled with a K at the end instead of a C. Each of these gods has their own city, with a palace where they supposedly live. I say supposedly because the Imperial author actually seems to doubt the fact that these gods are even real. Quote, "To an outsider, the priesthood of the Tribunal seems to be the true power in Morrowind. These tribunes, if they ever existed, have not been seen in centuries. The priests of the Tribunal cult are all-powerful in Morrowind. Strange processions of fantastically garbed priests roam the land, selecting new candidates to serve the Tribunal, who are seized without resistance and never seen again." End quote. YR adds, "Uncle, what is the last confirmed record of the Tribunal? My tutor always answered my question about their fate only with 'all divine endure.' Could Septim be the outsider prophesied by Lorkhan's cult? All signs point to the Tribunal's continued power, although dormant." The clans of Morrowind, which are today known as the Great Houses, are in complete control of the province's politics and trade. Currently there are 5 Great Houses, but the guide mentions that earlier there used to be a 6th one. Each house controls various smaller clans, various sub-clans, whose allegiances with the larger clans are mostly fixed, although from time to time some of them do switch allegiances. Despite the Tribunal's prohibition against wars between the Great Houses, they still fight, but they do so through the institution of Morak Tong. Morak Tong is the sanctioned assassin guild of Morrowind, so you can basically hire an assassin to eliminate your enemies. This is completely legal. In fact, it is almost a sacred tradition in the province, as you of course know if you've played Morrowind. The guide then goes on to describe the houses briefly. House Indoril is prominent, likely because it claims kinship with the 3 tribunes. Indorils control the city of Almalexia, which is of course the capital of Morrowind, and they also dominate tribunal priesthood, so at this point in the history of the province, they were by far the strongest. House Redoran guards the west of Morrowind, and they are described as the best warriors of the province. House Telvanni tends herds of giant insects in the eastern region of Morrowind. They are the most xenophobic house. The Imperial author also tells us about Telvanni bug musk, which is a favorite perfume of the Dark Elves, and also about their riding insects, a popular local export in the province, expensive in Almalexia or Narcissus. House Dress controls the southern Deshan Plain. Because of how fertile this region is, most Dress are plantation owners, and because of this, they are in need of a lot of slaves, so their entire economy is basically predicated on slavery. In fact, their capital city of Tyr is the center of slave trade. House Hlalu is, at this point, the smallest and the weakest, and they really only remain a great house because of their influential capital, Narcissus. They are sworn enemies of the Indoril, but they still manage to cling to their great house status despite the Indoril being basically in charge of the province. As for their occupation, they are mostly merchants and like to trade with the Empire. Finally, let's talk about some of the most interesting places in the province. Vvardenfell is the island separated from the rest of Morrowind by the remains of a crater. This is of course because on Vvardenfell you will find the volcano Red Mountain, the tallest mountain in Tamriel. The Red Mountain erupted in the year 668 of the First Era. It didn't damage the rest of Tamriel that much because it is separated from Morrowind by the Velothi Mountains, but for Morrowind it was a disaster. Quote, "The eruption is still recalled in the tales of numerous peoples. To the Nords it was the year of winter and summer. To the Khajiit, sun's death. Legend attributes its birth to the fall of a god to earth. Whatever the cause, Vvardenfell has slumbered uneasily for thousands of years, regularly blanketing the surrounding region with ash." End quote. Almalexia, meanwhile, is the largest and oldest city in Morrowind. In fact, it might possibly predate even the Dunmer, because it is allegedly built on the ruins of a dwarven city. Of course, if you ask the Dunmer about this, they will deny it categorically. Almalexia is the center of the Tribunal cult. It houses the palace temple of Mournhold, also called the City Within the City. And as the capital, it is also the seat of Dunmer government. The next place described is, interestingly enough, Sothasil. Quote, "Many tales are told of this clockwork city of brass, hidden in the steaming swamps of southern Morrowind, the lair of the most mysterious member of the Tribunal. No reliable reports exist of its location, however, or if this city even exists outside of story and song." End quote. And the last place highlighted is Necrom, the City of the Dead. Necrom is of course immensely important for the Dunmer religious tradition, and in fact this is from even before the Tribunal cult. This is harkening back to some of the older traditions of ancestor worship. The Dunmer often walk in month-long processions to Necrom to bring their dead there. In the city there is a complex hierarchy of priests and attendants whose only job is to inter the dead, which are then deposited into underground catacombs. Quote, "From the mainland, Necrom, with its lofty walls and wide towers, appears to be an immense necropolis, an impression that is strengthened by the constant traffic of corpses across the causeway into the city, a traffic which never ceases, day or night." End quote. Well, obviously, this entire description of Morrowind is for us probably the least interesting, since we've played the province, we've seen it with our own eyes. But there are still a few things there that caught my attention. For example, the processions of priests that are supposed to roam the countryside in Morrowind, and we never really got to see those in the game, presumably because of engine limitations. It's also important to keep in mind that the guide was written about 500 years before the game, give or take, so House Lalu, which is here described as the weakest, is actually on the rise in the times of The Elder Scrolls 3. Okay, now let's move on to the next chapter, which will be about 4 regions described by the Imperial author as the Wild Regions. The last section of the guide is titled The Wild Regions, and talks about 4 different regions which are in this way sort of relegated to the side. It's implied that they are not as important to the Empire and not really of interest. They are mostly described just to make the guide a bit more complete. As we will see, these regions are quite diverse, and we can find some pretty surprising ones here, especially the first one, which is Argonia. That's right, the home of the Argonians is relegated to the last chapter as a sort of aside. Argonia is inhabited by the lizard men known as Argonians. The guide tells us that Argonians are rarely seen outside of their homeland, except for a relatively intelligent strain called the Hist. These Hist are supposedly repulsive but peaceful, and because of this they are tolerated by humans. They are allowed to live even quite far from Argonia, including distant places like western Hammerfell. The Imperial author describes them as primitive, reclusive heathens, though, and talks about how they worship nature. Their religious ritual apparently requires a type of spore tree which can only be found in Argonia. And that's a big reason for why most Argonians tend to just stay there. As for the history of Argonia, the Imperial author highlights one important event, and by important I mean relevant to the Empire. In the year 2837 of the First Era, the region was seized by the Second Empire. Back then it was not just inhabited by the lizardmen Argonians, but also by the human Kothringi tribes. These tribes were quite interesting, but we don't really learn much about them, and we kind of have to rely on outside sources here. So for example, the well-known book series 2920, which is of course a fictionalized account of real events, describes them as silver-skinned, and Elder Scrolls Online tells us that they are the descendants of Needs, the Nedic tribe that we definitely mentioned at some point earlier in the guide. Anyway, so Argonia was seized in the First Era and became the imperial province of Black Marsh, and that's why it's still called Black Marsh today by humans. It is quite common for humans to call it that, whereas the elven name is Argonia. The author tells us that it's named after some ancient battlefield where many ancestors died, but YR has a little annotation here saying simply, "Does anyone on the Thalmor know what the humans are talking about?" Suggesting that this might not even be the case, or maybe this is just not common knowledge that YR is aware of. Argonia came to be dominated purely by the lizardmen because of the Nahatan flu. This was a deadly disease that swept through the region in the year 560 of the Second Era and wiped out all the Kothringi tribesmen. Interestingly enough, it did nothing to the Argonians because the Hist were immune to the plague. Now, this of course has led to speculation that they have in fact manufactured the plague by manipulating their spore trees. Either way, Black Marsh, or Argonia, has been independent since then, although parts of the region are still considered imperial territories by the more traditionally minded citizens of the Empire. The next region is the mysterious Pyandonia, a set of islands found to the far south of Tamriel. Pyandonia is apparently covered mostly by rainforests, and it is described as a, quote, playground for the southern water spirits, end quote. It is the home of the Maormer, which the author describes as a rare breed of tropical elf. These tropical elves almost never travel to Tamriel, which explains why we have never really seen any of them in any of the games. They don't even travel to the Somerset Isles, where their Altmer cousins live, since they were exiled from there in ancient times. Physically, they are said to have a chameleon-like skin, which makes it easier for them to camouflage themselves, kind of similarly to the Bosmer in their forests. They apparently practice powerful snake magic, and this mysterious magic allowed them to tame sea serpents, so they actually use them as steeds, they ride them, and they use them in warfare as well. The Maormer race is ruled by King Orgnum, who is apparently a deathless wizard, and is said to be the serpent god of Satakal. I am basically just quoting the guide here without adding really any of my own speculation or interpretation, because this paragraph is so short, yet it tells us so much, and Pyandonia honestly sounds amazing. On the third region, we have a bit more information, however. Thras is a number of islands located west of Tamriel, somewhere in the Abyssian Sea. This set of islands is described as coral kingdoms and the home of the Slode. The Slode are a kind of amphibious beast race, similar to slugs or toads. They are described as the godless tribe of beastmen and perhaps the most hated race in all of Tamriel. And there is a very good reason for this. In the year 2200 of the First Era, the Slode released the Thracian Plague, which was probably the most devastating disease in the history of Tamriel. In fact, it wiped out over half of Tamriel's population. It was so destructive that it actually led to the men, mer, and beast folk to join together to create a giant army. This army was called the All Flags Navy and was led by the King of Anvil, Bendu Olo, who we have of course mentioned in the Cyrodiilic section on Colovia. Quote, "The largest allied naval force in Tamrielic history sailed to Thras, slaughtered all the Slode they could find, and with great unknown magics, sunk their coral kingdoms into the sea." End quote. So seemingly, this was the complete end of the Slode. they were destroyed and their home was sunk into the sea. But now, as of the writing of the guide, there are reports of Thras rising again. The island seems to have risen mysteriously from the sea back up, and the Slode have been seen throughout Tamriel. The Imperial author makes it very clear that they are enemies of the Empire. Imperial citizens should avoid them. They should contact Imperial authorities if they encounter one. And to prove the point that the Slode are exceedingly dangerous, we get some excerpts from the notes of Bendu Olo himself. Listen to this. The life cycle of the Slode begins with them as little amorphous grubs. Apparently just these sort of disgusting grubs that can barely do anything. In their adolescent phase, they seem similar to octopi, and they cannot yet go on land. But as adults, they are of course amphibious, as I said already, and they can also grow to almost any size imaginable. And their virtually infinite lifespan makes them practically immortal as far as aging goes. On Tamriel, you can mostly find Slode which are old and corpulent, but if the Slode grows even bigger, they actually start collapsing under their own weight, and they cannot really move on their own, they must be buoyed by water. Alright, physically they don't seem that impressive, except for the immortality and infinite size, but what about their other gifts? Well, the Slode have a perfect memory. Even though they can't read or write, they don't really need to, because they remember everything. They are also described to be highly proficient with magic, especially the magic of the mysticism school. Apparently all Slode who travel to Tamriel know a powerful version of the recall spell, which allows them to travel great distances, and they can use it almost instinctively, so every time the Slode is in even a shadow of a danger, they can just instinctively teleport to safety. This of course makes it very difficult to fight with them. Now, they of course have some weaknesses or liabilities, notably their poor grasping ability and generally their poor ability to use tools, because their body doesn't really have limbs, they sort of need to adapt their skin to the things around them, and this adaptation is quite slow. Despite their ability to think very quickly, they also don't like to make rash decisions, and they like to think on things for a long while. As for their way of life, the Slode are often greedy. They usually make their living as merchants or smugglers, and they are described as highly cautious. Quote, "They have no word in their language for adventure. The closest equivalent means tragic disaster. All their heroic myths are about individuals who sit around and think for years and years, consulting cautiously with wise Slode, until finally they act, always deliberately, always successfully. All their mythic villains act quickly and always fail." End quote. But what makes them probably the most dangerous is the fact that, according to Bendu Olo, they have no moral compass. They are godless, self-loving schemers who like to manipulate everyone around them. They can pretend to be amused, they can pretend to be pleased, and so they have good diplomatic abilities, they are good at acting, but they actually feel no emotion, they feel no remorse, and they have no sense of morals. Now, I don't know about you, but the way these Slode are described, it makes them seem like the arch enemies of Tamriel, more so than the High Elves even, if I were to go in the direction of trying to define some of the races as enemies, of course. That's something that we can maybe discuss in the comments. But before we get there, let's talk about the last region, which is Orsinium. Orsinium is a region inhabited by various types of goblinkin. This is the sort of generic name for orcs, ogres, gremlins, and other beast folk not classified as one of the ones that we've already mentioned. The word Orsinium means Orc Town in early Aldmeris, but if you were to call it Orc Town, it sounds kind of not too impressive, which is why the locals prefer the elven name. It makes it sound more noble. The Imperial author, however, tells us directly that this attempt at making the place sound nice is pointless. It is a filthy, rancid backwater, and there is no reason for anyone to go there. Orsinium was founded during the Camoran dynasty. During this period, the Somerset ruler set many of the beastmen free and sent them north of Valenwood to find their own place to live. They ended up choosing mountains in High Rock. Quote, "For their people were, and most still are, dependent on a rare shaggy giant centipede herd beast that can live only at high altitudes on alpine and subalpine forage." End quote. So they founded this town in the mountains, and during the first era the town was quite strong. During the Ragada invasion, their ranks were even bolstered by orcs fleeing the invasion, so the town grew to a more impressive size. At some point, the Orsinium army grew bold enough that they wanted to take control of the Bjolsey River and force the city of Wayrest to pay them regular tribute. Because of this, they spent a long time fighting an army composed mainly of the Okudan Order of Diagna and the chieftain kings of early Daggerfall. However, as I said, the war lasted quite a long time, and after a 30-year siege of the city of Orsinium, the town was completely ruined. During the era when the Akaviri ruled the empire, Orsinium briefly became an imperial territory, but this was then reverted with the death of Savirian Chorak, the last potentate, and now, in the third era, the orcs would like to become part of the empire again. In fact, they have petitioned Tiber Septim to let them join, but apparently Tiber Septim is famous for his complete disdain for the orcs, so he hasn't even deigned to answer them. And that's it for Orsinium. Well, believe it or not, but the pocket guide to the empire actually ends here. Is it just me, or does this ending feel quite abrupt? Either way, this is also the ending of our podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Now, I could definitely go into lengths to talk about how I found the various parts of this guide, and maybe I will do this one day. But for now, I just want to sort of reflect on the fact that every region has a lot of original elements. Some take more inspiration than others from real-world examples. For example, High Rock seems quite similar to typical medieval fantasy, but in the best Elder Scrolls fashion, there is always this subversion of tropes that I find really fascinating, and I love the way that all the regions were portrayed in this guide, and I'm happy that it's basically still the foundation of Elder Scrolls lore, even though Bethesda often chooses to deviate from this or lean more into the generic parts rather than the unique parts. Anyway, as someone who is the most invested in Tamriel Rebuilt and Project Tamriel, I very much look forward to seeing modders tackle these regions. And with that, I thank you very much for listening to this podcast. As I'm editing it right now, I'm realizing that there are a lot of things that I still have to improve substantially, but I still hope you enjoyed it. I hope you find it interesting and educational. And yeah, let me know which topics you would like to see me cover in this format in the future. That's it from me. Have a great day, and Am Civi Bless.